I'm Effie, and apparently today I've decided I'm giving Edna mode chic. At least I hope it's chic. It feels very Edna mode though, with the big glasses. But they have whiskers. They also have paw prints, but they're like inside the arms. Anyway, hi, I'm Effie, and today's video is going to be my May reading wrap up. I've got a number of books to go through. I don't think I ever knew how many books I read in the month of May, but it's a few. And yeah, we're just gonna run through them. I am historically quite rubbish about speaking about books, which, I mean, I have a booktube channel. Why am I so bad talking about books? But I am, so that's what it is. I will try and remember to chapter this video because I am incredibly forgetful. But I will try and remember to chapter this video. So if you want to skip ahead to a particular book, go right ahead. I mean, I'm not going to know either way anyway. So first up, we've got A Cursed Son by Leitao. This is a arranged marriage, forced marriage kind of story between a human, or supposedly human, and the, exiled, shamed Fae prince, although technically king. And you see this kind of slow burn magic as they're immediately enamored with one another, but they shouldn't be. And because he's kind of forced her into this marriage, she's like, oh, he doesn't really want me. He just thinks I'm convenient. And it's just written in such a compelling way. And the romance is so sizzling. And then there's a fantasy plot going on in the background, and I had a really good time with this book, and I am desperately looking forward to reading the sequel and finding out more about these characters' backstories and what's going to happen in this world next. And I'm really happy to have found another indie romance author, fantasy romance author to dive into and explore further. Next up is ROTGUT by H.S. Wolfe. This is a weird book, but really enjoyable. It involves aliens and infestation, performing surgery on oneself, and it's also dealing with kind of anxiety and borderline personality disorder. It's a very short and sweet one, and as I say, is incredibly weird. It's also incredibly queer, and I had an absolutely fantastic time with it. Only a Monster and the sequel, Never a Hero, by Vanessa. So in this world, we are not following, as you might be able to tell from the title, the sort of hero of the story. We are following these characters who are monsters, and they truly are quite monstrous because they are able to travel in time by stealing life from humans, and they see it as their right and that humans are below them, and why should they care that they are stealing life from humans in order to be able to travel in time and experience all of these different things. But then you've got this character who is half monster, half human, and she is trying to come to terms with the fact that half of her feels this soul-deep yearning to travel through time, but half of her is human, and she has a whole human side of the family that is getting impacted, or be it directly or indirectly, by the fact that monsters exist. And then there's all kinds of kind of plots weaving around that something's going on with the Monster King. And the they're so intricate. And one of the things that really stood out for me is that I hate a love triangle. I mean, it was more than 3 parties, but I think the only time that I have read a book where a love triangle worked for me and like didn't end in polyamory, which, you know, love triangle isn't annoying when everyone gets together. But the only time a love triangle has previously worked for me was in the follow-on series to The Selection by Kira Cass. Because I think the real difficulty in writing a love triangle is that as an author, you probably know who your character is going to end up with. So you're going to write in such a way that makes it very clear to the reader who the eventual love interest is. And that makes it very difficult as a reader to really care about this stupid triangle, love angle, whatever's going on. But what I liked about Only a Monster and Never a Hero is that you genuinely feel like your main character has a connection to both of these boys. And you also don't feel as if it's clear-cut who she might end up with. And whilst possibly it's just my queer little heart being incredibly optimistic, maybe it'll end up in polyamory. We don't know. As far as I'm aware, the 3rd book in the trilogy has not been announced, but I know that when it was sold at auction and it was sold as a trilogy. So presumably Len is under contract to write the 3rd book, and we will be getting a 3rd book. And if it's anything like book 1 and 2, it's going to be well worth the wait. But I am feeling incredibly impatient to read the next book because they were so good. And the ramifications of the events of book 2, I think, are going to have a very interesting story for us to read when we finally get the conclusion of the series. Law and Lust, The Vanishing by Karla and Nikole is the 2nd book in the Law and Lust trilogy, which is a romantasy series that follows 2 vampires, and it's and both of the main characters are BIPOC, so it's a little bit more diverse than some of the other popular vampire stories out there. Something that I really like about this book is that you are starting at a point where your main couple is in a committed relationship. So this book is actually giving you a chance to see what you don't often get in books, and that's the daily life and sometimes just the moments of peace and quiet where a couple just gets to share being together. I thought it was really interesting to see the way that this couple's relationship developed and evolved. There's also a very intriguing fantasy plotline going on in the background, because approximately 200 years ago, a whole heap of vampires just disappeared, and you're trying to figure out what happened to those vampires. You also get to see romances with some of the side characters blossoming, and that was just so lovely to see as well. And I'm very excited to pick up book 3, and I believe there's also a novella that comes after book 3, and I think there's also like a follow-on series. So I've still got quite a lot in this world to explore, and I'm so happy about that. Your Coffin or Mine by Jacklyn Hyde. What can I say about this book? So Dracula for the past 100 years has been allowing himself to desiccate in his castle, and his friend comes up with this stupid scheme that they're going to turn his castle into a hotel, and he basically says, oh yeah, we're running low on money, so we're going to have to turn it into a hotel. And as a result of that, a Instagram influencer comes and stays at the hotel, and then Dracula and the influencer fall in love. And it's a very smut heavy book, and that's fine if that's what you want, obviously. But I think the issue I had, it was basically twofold. One is that not enough time and attention was given to developing the lore. I felt like a lot more attention went into writing the smut than actually developing the lore. And there were certain points where that seemed like a glaring issue. And the second thing is that the influencer character didn't feel authentic to a 26-year-old. And it also felt almost as if the author was parroting what she thought influencer lingo was, and how someone who is 26 years old might speak. There were a couple of times where certain words were used which I think are derived from AAVE, but are sort of words that seem to have been coming into more common parlance as a result of the internet, but they felt like they weren't being used in the correct way. And there was also this one comment that really rubbed me up the wrong way, and it's partially because of this weird thing that's coming about where millennials just seem to be hated in both directions. And this 26-year-old character, who is an influencer, was talking about how Dracula was looking at her breasts and compared the way he was looking at her breasts to a millennial being excited by a Starbucks. And what? It was a really, really weird sentence, and I didn't like it. So with regards to the fact that the lore wasn't developed, just to explain a bit further, before Dracula and this influencer first have sex, the book's told in alternating POVs. So we're in Dracula's head when this is about to happen, and he's thinking about the fact that he is unable to impregnate her because he's a vampire. And at the time you think nothing of it because that's fairly common in vampire lore. But later on, they're talking about whether Dracula was made or born, and it's never really clarified. So basically, the influencer character's saying, oh, who made you this way? Or something like that. And Dracula goes, oh, my father, he found his bride and then I was born. And it's like, well, were you made or were you born? And the implication of that is if he was born, then surely that means vampires can impregnate people. And it just didn't work, unfortunately. And it was a real drag to get through. It started off, a bit roll your eyes. Okay, this is kind of cheesy, but it'll be a fun romp. And then it just very quickly became torturous to read. Everyone who can forgive me is dead. So this is the kind of story that seems to be relatively popular right now. It's a case of 10 years ago when our main character was at university, or well, college, because it's set in America. A tragedy occurred and she knows more than she's telling about what happened during this tragedy. Everyone says she's the lucky one to have escaped, but actually it's not quite that simple. And I think this is a difficult book to talk about and critique, because in order to do that, you have to kind of give away the twist. So I will say, skip forward a little bit if you do not want to be spoiled. So the reason that this didn't work particularly well for me was because the central idea is that this character has blacked out the events of what actually happened, and she lied to the police and said, oh, I saw this thing happen, but she actually has no recollection of what happened. But she's decided that because she can't remember, it's her brain has decided to force her to forget so that she doesn't remember committing the crimes that happened during this tragedy. But the problem is, the book is trying so hard to tell you that obviously she's not going to be the one that committed these crimes. And what ends up happening is you end up getting a book that is incredibly predictable, because you go, well, it's obviously not her, because it's just repeatedly telling us again and again that she did this, so she obviously didn't. And the number of people that can have committed it is very limited anyway. So it didn't really work. And then add into that the fact that I was listening to it as an audiobook, and like, this is very much reader error, but I had an impression that it was a much larger scale tragedy than it was. Essentially what had happened was someone was pushed out of a window on, I don't know, like the second floor or whatever. And then when she was pushed out the window, she landed on top of a pedestrian who was walking along, so 2 people died. But like, there was some stabbing before this person got pushed out the window. But like, that was the scale of the tragedy. And it didn't fit with the level of sensationalization that happened around it. The Ever King by LJ Andrews, I picked this up because my best friend was reading it and she was like, I'm really enjoying this, like, you should read it too. And it's basically, there's a whole heap of different fae in this world, but like 20 years, was it 20 years ago or 10 years ago? A period of time ago, the world of the fae was divided using this spell that literally like cut the world in half. And then our FMC manages to accidentally reopen it. So the fae on the other side kind of come through, they kidnap her, and it becomes this romance between these 2 characters. It's theoretically meant to be enemies to lovers and you're not meant to like him. But considering like that's what it says on the content warning, it's like, this is not a good character, he's not a nice person, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, he's very mild. Or maybe I'm the problem, because there was something involving eyes, but apart from that, I was like, oh, this is so tame. Fair enough. It was actually like quite a good story, but I'm sitting here and like, clearly it was quite forgettable for me because I don't really remember that much that happened, which I don't know if that means that not much happened or that it just was a very forgettable story. I would recommend reading it. I just think it's one of those that's probably kind of a throwaway title. Oh, Nightwatching by Tracy Sierra. So I picked this up because it's one of Kayla Books and Layla's Literally Dead book club picks, and I did want to read them all this year, but you know, life always gets in the way and I ended up not being on top of it. I think this is the only one that I've read so far. And I remember at the time when she announced that this was going to be one of the book club picks, that she'd read people were saying that the synopsis gave it away, or like to be very careful to not get spoiled because you end up having too much information as you go in. So I went in knowing literally nothing about this book and having an absolutely amazing time. What I will say, because I don't want to spoil it in any way for anyone, and I do highly recommend that you pick it up. It's an incredibly incisive book, and it touches on some similar things to the book Delicate Condition, like very, very different books, but also if you've read Delicate Condition by Danielle Valentine, I can't comment on how much of those themes were transferred into the TV show Delicate American Horror Story, because I haven't actually watched it yet. But yeah, if you've read Delicate Condition and like some of the things that are brought up in that, you can see similarities in Nightwatching, and it was so tense and well written, and probably one of the most thrilling thrillers that I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. And I'd be interested to know if it's one of those books that stands up to rereading, or if it's a case of once you've read it, it's not going to be the same on reread. But I guess we'll see, because I can't imagine this is the only time I do ever read it, because I did have a truly incredible time reading this book. Here for the Wrong Reasons by Lydia Wang and Annabel Paulsen. This book I picked up because I felt like it was going to be a sapphic equivalent to The Charm Offensive by Alison Cochrane. So we have a whole bevy of contestants on a TV show that I think is set up in a very similar way to The Bachelor. So we've got this whole heap of women who are trying to compete for a proposal from our leading man. And then we've got these two women in particular that we are following along and seeing their journey on the show. And we've got one woman that pretty much from the off, we know she's not interested in him because she's not interested in men. And this other woman is kind of a bit of a wallflower, and she doesn't know if she dislikes her fellow contestant or if she actually is crushing on her. It's kind of a slow burn, but it also gets a lot spicier than I expected. I think because I have this impression that on these reality TV shows, they're constantly being filmed, so they wouldn't have the privacy to ever be able to, get together in a physical sense. But I think something that I liked about this show is there were ways that it could have gone that, would have been homophobic, or potentially the possibility of a forced outing. And it didn't go in that direction and was a lot more accepting and comforting. And I really, really liked that it didn't tread down this path that would have been so easy to go down, and just ended up being a really sweet and cute contemporary sapphic romance. Oh, Evocation by S.T. Gibson. Oh, I loved this book so much. I was incredibly lucky to get an early listening copy of this book, so I actually listened to it, before it came out. And it's narrated by Oscar Reyes, who I'm pretty sure narrates I want to say it's the Lioness trilogy by Sierra Simone. I think so anyway. I think I have listened to him narrate audiobooks before, and he does an absolutely fantastic job of narrating this audiobook. So the story is that we've got this character called David Aristarkov, and he is approaching his 30th birthday. At least I believe that's what age he's approaching. Now I'm doubting myself. He's a very powerful medium, and he's never put any protections in place to protect himself from being possessed. But because he's so powerful, he's so incredibly cocky about it. But then he starts becoming slowly more and more possessed, and he has to employ the help of his ex-boyfriend Reese, whose name escapes me, and Reese's wife, Moira. And Moira is also a powerful medium. She also deals with astrology and tarot and all kinds of different things. And Reese, I think, is just a sorcerer. I say just, he is incredibly powerful in his own right. And what you end up getting is this story that is very character driven as you see the dynamics between David, Reese, and Moira constantly shift as they try to find their places in each other's world. And you also have this story in the background of a race against the clock, because they have to find out what's going on with David and why all of a sudden he's starting to be possessed. And this is the first book in a series that I believe has been contracted as 4 books, but we are also getting a prequel later in the year, which I am incredibly excited to read, because I'm an absolute nerd, and so apart from the prequel that I haven't been able to track down a copy of, but I know is being massively reworked before publication, so it's not a story that the author themselves kind of stands with or like stands by. It's very much a testament of her earlier writing. But with the exception of that, I am in the middle of reading Robber Girl, and that is the last thing by S.T. Gibson that I have to read, because I have been, like, I've scoured the internet, basically. Well, not quite that level, but, you know, I've read Evocation, I've read A Diary of Blood, Education in Malice, a short story, and then I went through Saint's Tumblr and read all the ficlets. Like, I know that I love S.T. Gibson's writing now, so I'm just love it. Okay, let's move on before I spend the next however long just saying how much I enjoy S.T. Gibson's writing. So we've got For Real by Alexis Hall. This is the 3rd book in the Spires series. I think, was it a couple of weeks ago? I did a roundup last time, but it's the book that comes after Waiting for the Flood. But these books are, they're contemporary, so it's a shared world, like it's our world. But these are contemporary romances, and I don't know if it's just that this book has a cameo from other characters and it's not something we see elsewhere in the series, but we do get a cameo from a character that we've seen elsewhere in the Spires series. But how to talk about this book? Well, it is very, very, very smutty. And that makes sense, because the core principle is that you've got a sub who life hasn't dealt him a fun hand, and he's just a bit cynical with life. And then you've got this incredibly optimistic sunshine Dom, who is 19 years old, and the two of them meet at a kink club, and they shouldn't work, but they really, really, really do work. And it's this really touching story of the way that this Dom sort of instinctually knows the best ways to take care of this very cynical sub, and they work through the fact that they do have such a glaring age difference between them, but also they are so well suited to one another and they complement each other so well. And I really, really enjoyed it. And I've read a fair number of Alexis Hall's books, but I think this might actually be my favourite Alexis Hall. that I have ever read. Also, have Google handy, maybe an incognito browser, because you're going to want to look up things to try and figure out what these people are playing with. The next book that I read was a novella-length book, and it was The Fireborne Blade by Charlotte Bond. This is a very short story, and it has some interesting twists and turns, and it's very much like an introduction to the world. But you've got this knight who, you know, she ended up doing something that meant she had to regain her honor. So she decides the way that she's going to do that is by retrieving the Fireborne blade. But the only problem is that sword is being guarded by a fierce dragon known as the White Lady. And as you progress through this story, you get excerpts from this kind of story that's telling the history of all the different dragons as they've been slain, and the way that when dragons are slain, magic is released, and often it results in disaster and the death of the people that have slain them, and also horrible things happen to the environment around them. So you have this sense of what's going to happen as, you know, when she manages to achieve her goal. But also, she's got a bracelet on her wrist that she doesn't remember being there and also doesn't quite fit. She's got a squire she doesn't remember hiring and doesn't particularly like. So things are not quite adding up. And then you also get a couple of chapters that are flashing back to show how she got to the point that she was at. And I think, yeah, so this is very much like first book in a series, just kind of laying the groundwork. But I think it's very fascinating, the world that has been created with these dragons. And also there is some misogyny in the world with relation to the magic, less so with being a knight and whatever, because you have got this woman who is a knight. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in subsequent books as a result of the events that we saw in the Fireborne Blade. And I actually do have an arc of the sequel, so I'm hoping I'll get a chance to get to that soon, but it isn't out until the latter half of the year, so it might be a wee minute before I get to it. Inside the Wicked by Chloe C. Penaranda. This is the sequel and the finale of the duet to Behind the Broken. So, you know, it's a sequel, so I can't get too much into what's going on in this book. But in Behind the Broken, we have Anastasia Kinsley, who is the daughter of a presidential candidate, and Rhett Kaiser, who secretly runs what essentially amounts to a vigilante group whose primary focus is to take down criminals and has particular interest in taking down trafficking rings. But his main goal in life is to destroy his uncle, who murdered his fiancée 4 years before you meet him in Behind the Broken. And in order to, and basically these two paths cross when Rhett Kaiser poses as I think it's FBI, maybe Secret Service agent, in order to become Anna's bodyguard, and then they have to pretend they're dating because they get papped, and yeah, romance ensues. So this is following on from the events at the end of Behind the Broken, and you get more into seeing the networks of the criminal underground. You also get introduced to a few new characters, and it's also setting up romances that we're likely to see further on in the series. We are introduced to this character called Silas, who I absolutely love. He is a terrible man, but he is so fun to read about. And I like that you never know where you stand with him. But he is a criminal that seems to have a code, which always makes for very compelling characters. My Darling Dreadful Thing by Johanna van Veen. This is set in the 1950s and we are following Roosja, who has a spirit companion that her mother has been taking advantage of in order to run seances. And Roos is, I think she's in her early 20s, maybe late, like she's an adult, but her mother has deliberately been starving her and making her look like she's a much younger girl in order to titillate her male clients. She also dresses her in flimsy gowns. And then one day, a woman called Agnes comes to one of the seances and a connection is formed between Roos and Agnes, and basically Agnes buys Roos off Roos's mother, and then the story kind of commences. So the way that this book is told is that you have chapters of Roos's story, and then at the end of, I would say most of the chapters, you have an extract that's an interview between Roos and her doctor. So you know something's happened in the future that means that Roos is being interviewed by a doctor. You know there's a crime that happens. So the story is basically building up towards that. And I think like there was some interesting twists and turns with this book, but I wanted a little bit more. I don't know quite what I wanted, but I just felt like the story kind of underserved me. I also think that I needed a bit more doubt. Like I think the ending was perhaps meant to be a little bit more open, but I think Roos is such a believable character that the ending was not quite as open as perhaps the intention was there for. I'm so sorry. I feel like I'm not making much sense today. I hope I do make sense to you, but I feel like I'm just rambling, and I do apologise for that. I am trying and probably failing. If I dip out, it's because I've run out of battery. So the final full-length novel that I've got to talk about before I get into graphic novels, comics, manga is Honey by Isabel Banta. And this was such an incredible way to end my month of reading, because this is a story that initially feels like a cross between Daisy Jones and the Six and I'm Glad My Mom Died. So obviously that already sets it up as being a very intriguing story. So the primary idea is when you open the story, you're told about the way that our protagonist, Amber Young, has caused a split between, I can't remember their names. I know the girl's called Gwen Morris and, West Kingston. So it's basically this newspaper article that's like, what really happened and how did Amber Young break up Hollywood's favourite couple, West Kingston and Gwen Morris. So you know something happened and you're kind of like leading up towards that. But also you start the story in Amber's childhood when she is, I think she's like 8 years old, and she first gets spotted performing at a school talent show, and there just happens to be a talent scout there that sees her and goes, okay, I want her, she can sing, she's amazing, kind of thing. So you're following her before she manages to find success, but kind of right from the off, you're seeing the way that the entertainment industry is just a little bit shady and just a little bit gross. And what I found really interesting, and I think it is a deliberate thing, is that the title of Honey, at least in my mind as I was reading it, comes from the fact that a lot of times, like, Amber is referred to just as honey, like, oh, show a little bit more skin, honey, etc., etc. And I think by the end of the story, you see another place that the title of Honey could come from, but it's all part of the growth as this story develops. But the more I read of this book, and the more complex Amber's story was, the more I was just absolutely blown away and so fascinated. And also I felt so much for Amber because she was not dealt an easy hand of cards and she played them so well. And by the end of the book, I was crying because it was just so beautiful, so impactful. I had such a good time reading this book, and I absolutely adored Amber and her journey. And I hope that this book gets all the success it deserves because it was so good. Right, I'm gonna take a break here because I'm about to run out of battery, and then when I come back, I will talk about the graphic novels and manga. And we're back to it. I think this is a wee bit closer than last time, but oh well. So we're on to the graphic novels, mangas, and comics. So I tried to do a 31 in 31 with graphic novels, mangas, and comics, and I failed. So ultimately what ended up happening is I ended up having more graphic novels and comics and manga than I normally would, but not a full month. And it just means that I've got so many more books. So, I Guess in the House by E.M. Carroll. What to say about this? Absolutely gorgeous artwork. You can't fault Carroll's artistic ability. But I think the story was a little tricky for me to get behind. I'm not 100% sure I understand the ending, but that's fine. Like, I had a good time and enjoyed it as I was reading it. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say, but it was good, a little bit confusing, but that's generally how I feel when I read graphic novels by Carroll, and I'm definitely going to keep trying because there is a certain magic to them, especially the way that the story does kind of just end at the peak of the drama. I Married My Best Friend to Shut My Parents Up by Kodama Naoka. It was okay. It's a one-shot sapphic story. I think my biggest issue is that I wanted to see more. The story kind of ends just as they're sort of admitting feelings for each other. And I just wanted to get to see a bit more of them actually together. And I think to add to the disappointment, there's some like shorts after the main story. So you think you've got more of the book to be able to spend more time with them. But actually it's just shorts of an unrelated story. So that was a bit sad. It was okay, but like I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend it. Die Number 1 by Kieron Gillen. So this is literally the first issue. It's not even the first volume. So you're just introduced to the story of these kids that end up going on a quest as a result of a D&D game. I think it's going to be a really interesting story, and it's definitely something that I want to read the rest of. And I like that there are 20 issues in total. I think it's issues, because like it's all around D20. And I think there's a lot of intrigue about what happened when they went on the quest, because the story is basically like you see them as kids about to play this game, and then you jump forward in time and you see them like afterwards. So I'm looking forward to uncovering all the different secrets, and I think it is going to be a good time. The artwork is gorgeous, but I don't feel like I've read enough to really be able to give many thoughts or judgments on it just yet. Whistle by E. Lockhart. This is part of the DC graphic novel series where they basically have like best-selling YA authors writing DC stories. I picked this up and I think I expected something different. I've lent out my copy of Catwoman to my best friend, which is where I first saw the advert for Whistle. But she kindly sent across photos of the pages at the end of Catwoman, and looking back on them, I can see why I thought I was going to get a different story than I did, but also I can see how that story translates to the story that I did get with Whistle. So this is the story about the hero called Whistle, and her superpower she can call dogs or something. It's very boring, very like, this is a superhero power. And what I was hoping for was a lot more of the Riddler, because Enigma, the Riddler, is in her life, but he's kind of an antagonist, but not really. You also have some of Poison Ivy, but they decided to erase her queer identity, which was a really strange move, because I'm pretty sure in Catwoman you got to see like Poison Ivy in her sapphic relationship. But again, like, I've lent my copy out, so I'm not 100% sure. It was so disappointing on so many fronts, especially because I'd been looking forward to it and thinking it was going to be something really good, and it was just a waste. The Nice House on the Lake, Volume 1 by James Tynion IV. I think this story's split into two, so I've only read the first half of it. But essentially, this gang of friends are invited to a holiday at this beautiful lakeside cabin, and then the world ends. And there's a lot more dark secrets involved. It's absolutely horrific. The way that the world ends is it's very much like there's a lot of body horror to it, and like there's a lot of different secrets that obviously haven't been unmasked because it's only half the story. But I will be continuing it because I think I saw the second half of it for maybe like £4 on Kindle, and I was like, yes, I need to continue this story, so I'm gonna get it. £4 seems like a good deal. But I think my biggest issue was that there's quite a large cast of characters, so at least initially it was a little bit challenging to keep track of who the different characters are, especially because every character has like a name, a symbol, and a title associated with them. And it took me way longer than it should have to realise that the symbols actually did look like the things they were. So like the artist would look like a paint palette, and the accountant would look like some sums. But I do highly, highly recommend it. And I definitely think it's probably one of those that might be a bit easier to read in physical format, because you can keep flicking back and figuring out which characters are which. But also look up content warnings because it is incredibly dark, and as I say, the body horror, with it being a graphic novel, is quite extreme as well. Fairy Tale Volume 1 by Hiro Mishima. There's not much to it. In fact, I can't remember much about it. I think it's just a kind of cutesy little manga where they go along and do magic things and have quests. It wasn't really my cup of tea, but it was something a little bit different, and it's always nice to try something different and a little bit out of your comfort zone to see if it works for you. And I guess it's a shame that this didn't work for me, but it was, as I say, nice to try something a little bit different. Oh my gosh, I almost pressed stop then. I'm not ready to stop yet. Mycroft Holmes and the Apocalypse Handbook by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Straight in the bin. Like, not literally, I will just, like, I'll unhaul it on Vinted or whatever. But I despised it. It was really torturous to read. It had quite puerile humour in places. It wasn't a very good story at all. I think as well, like, the bar's quite high when it comes to Sherlock Holmes stories, because my first introduction with the world of Sherlock Holmes was some abridged audiobooks on CD that my parents had as a kid, and I listened to a whole heap of abridged classics as a kid. So I do vividly remember listening to The Hound of the Baskervilles. I don't remember if I listened to any other Sherlock stories. So that was kind of my introduction to Sherlock. And then I'm the right age that when the Sherlock BBC TV show was on, like, I was watching that a lot. So that's kind of my bar for it. And I know that it hasn't aged well as a TV show, and a lot of the actors are not particularly brilliant people, but in my mind, like, Mycroft is, I think it's Mark Gatiss who plays in the TV show, or Gatiss, and he was fantastic as Mycroft. So that's kind of who I'm thinking of. And obviously that's not fair, because that may not be how Mycroft was intended. But he's horrible in Mycroft Holmes and the Apocalypse Handbook. And it's so surface level and so lowest common denominator humour. I hated it so much. Also, fun fact, I'm sure everyone knows this and I'm just late to the party, but I didn't realise that House, as in like the TV show with Hugh Laurie, is a Sherlock adaptation. Like, it makes sense when someone says it, but and then we've got two more. So, The Promised Neverland Volume 1 by Kaiju Shirai and Posuka Demizuka. Nope, that was not right. Posuka Demizu. I had previously read maybe about half of it, a third of it. So I did know the twist going into this volume, and, you know, it holds up pretty well. You know, it's only the first volume in a manga, and I think it is quite an expansive manga. So you're not gonna get too much, but there's enough that I feel intrigued, and I definitely do think I'm probably going to continue it at some point in the future. But I believe it's Shonen Jump, so I can probably read it on the Shonen Jump app rather than trying to get volumes of it, which, as much as I enjoy and prefer reading graphic novels, manga and comics physically, I think getting it on the Shonen Jump app and not having to pay the prices that physical costs, probably the way forward, to be honest. And the final graphic novel that I read, and the final book, was Cheer Up, Love and Pom-Poms by Crystal Fraser. This is a queer graphic novel that takes place in like high school, and we have a trans girl and a plus size lesbian girl, and they are on a cheerleading team, and it's a really heartwarming story, and there's a little bit of a love story between them. It is very sweet, and I do recommend, if you want something that's fluffy but has a little bit of hard-hitting themes underneath. And yeah, that's it. I hope this video hasn't been too bad and I haven't done too terrible a job at talking about the books that I read in the month of May. I would love to know if you've read anything that stood out to you, either positively or negatively, in May. But until next time, love you. Bye.